And welcome on into the debut episode of Still Enrolled, a Big Ten football podcast where we talk about, you guessed it, Big Ten football. This is going to be an insanely crazy year where we have 18 teams, 4 newcomers, a 12-team college football playoff. This is going to be one of the craziest college football seasons we've ever seen, and couldn't be more excited to now be firing up this podcast with you for what is going to be a crazy Big Ten year. I am Ryan Hickey. Welcome. Thank you for joining us here on this debut episode. Each and every episode, I will be joined alongside my co-host,
Brian Tripp. Hi. How's it going? Also, you said insanely crazy year, an insanely crazy host for people that don't know you from all of your national radio gigs and everything you've done in New York and all over the country the last couple of years.
That, unfortunately, moniker is very, very true.
Do you know how many texts I've gotten already since the announcement of this podcast? And we'll figure it out where we're not going to talk over each other. How many hot takes is Hickey going to have on this podcast? My whole text thread is, I can't believe you agreed to do this with him. So I'm hoping maybe to be the level-headed, knowledgeable guy who's actually on the sidelines at Big Ten games and bring that to the podcast. But I'm sure you're going to fire off some hot takes that you've become well known for, not just in the Big Apple, but all I would say coast to coast.
Definitely coast to coast. See, that's why you're on the pod, because yes, I apparently start too many fires here and say too many outlandish things where if it wasn't for you, this podcast, Brian, is not happening. You are the level-headed man. You bring sense to the pod. I guarantee most listeners and watchers will probably side with a lot of things you say. So you bring a good balance to the pod. We need you, man.
Yeah, I appreciate that. But I'll be back on the sidelines for Penn State football this season and covering the Big Ten all year long. And this has been a passion project for us that we talked about doing over the summer. And I'm glad we can finally hit the ground running just in time. We're kicking off the podcast just in time for kickoff. Well done.
Absolutely.
Thanks.
Like Brian said, so I am Ryan Hickey, based here in New York City, a Penn State alum, but also a national sports radio host on the Infinity Sports Network. Some nicknames that I definitely do not encourage. Hot Take Hickey is, I think, just misguided and flat out false. But that nickname has traveled, as Brian said. And Tripp, like you said, you are the brains really of this podcast. Mr. Level-Headed will be on the sidelines each and every Saturday, exclusively covering not only Penn State football, but also, of course, their opponents and all of the Big Ten as well.
Yeah, and worked in the past with Big Ten Network, Westwood One Sports. So excited to bring that perspective to this podcast. Let's get going.
Why waste any more time? Let's go. We got a lot here in this debut episode to dive into. Where I want to start, Tripp, let's just go all the way to the end of the season here for a second. Because ESPN released this week Bubble Watch. Now that we have a 12-team playoff, bracketology is not just for college basketball. It's also now entering college football. And they had some predictions, basically how the end of the year they think will look, that I want to run by you here. First and foremost, they had Ohio State as the second-ranked team when it comes to the college football playoff field, which means the Buckeyes would have won the Big Ten Conference. I want to start by asking you this. Would you say right now as we enter the season that Ohio State is your favorite to win the conference here in 2024?
On paper, they have the most proven talent. However, when you start to peel back the layers to the Big Ten, Oregon also has comparable talent, but more unknowns. Yes, Ohio State is bringing in a new offensive coordinator in Chip Kelly. Ryan Day, for the first time, is not calling plays. But the known factor for Ryan Day, and going back to his predecessors, and has always been the Ohio State offense. Last year, and maybe you can solely pinpoint this on Kyle McCord, or do you pinpoint it on Kyle McCord and the offensive line play? Ohio State's defense was what was the known commodity with Jim Knowles last season. Number 2 in scoring, number 3 in yards per game, number 1 against the pass, and number 29 against the rush, and that's playing against a really, really good Big Ten schedule. And you could tell what they did, especially in the game against Penn State, the 20-12 win that they had against Penn State at the Shoe. it was that defense that was the known. So I think the expectation is with Chip Kelly, with Will Howard, but then Travion Henderson and Quinshad Junkins at running back. The plethora of wide receivers, Egbuka, known commodity, freshmen coming in. There's so much to like about Ohio State. And yeah, we can say that there's a couple different pieces. Kelly, quarterback, extra running back. They probably have top 2-round running backs on their roster. But still, even with those small unknowns, Oregon, Dan Lanning's back, defensive coach. But Oregon's going to have a great offense no matter what. Receiver, quarterback. Yeah, they're all really talented, and everyone expects Dylan Gabriel to have a monster season. There's still a little bit more unknown, right? Because about Oregon putting those puzzle pieces together, I think it's 1A and 1B between those two. And then the biggest factor, Ohio State has to go to Eugene. That game might be the one that decides who ultimately wins the Big Ten. Or is it just a preview of a conference title game rematch in Indianapolis?
Well, that's where ESPN has, at least they have Oregon winning that regular season game, and then they say that Ohio State gets revenge in a rematch in the Big Ten title game, which is how the Buckeyes do grab that number 2 seed. Honestly, for me, Tripp, I would say right now Oregon's the favorite to win the conference. There are definitely questions. New quarterback, how does Dylan Gabriel fit in the system? I think his fit, along with the talent around him, is perfect. I think it's seamless for what they're asking him to do and the talent at receiver, at offensive line they have. But speaking of offensive line, while there's so much known with Ohio State, like you said, in terms of their returning talent, bringing in guys like Quinshon Judkins, Caleb Downs, like they are just an all-star team and one of the most talented rosters maybe we've ever seen in college football. But they, to me, have 2 questions that I feel better about when it comes to Oregon than Ohio State. I think these 2 questions are going to determine who wins the Big Ten. Quarterback, offensive line.
Yep.
Will Howard is an upgrade over Kyle McCord. I don't think it's by that much. And I know you could say, he doesn't need to do that much because the run game and because of the great defense.
What about the system, though? What about the system? Chip Kelly's system maximizes a quarterback's potential. Whether it was in what he's done in college or in the National Football League even, Chip Kelly has proven that he can maximize a quarterback, and Will Howard does at least bring the mobility factor that Kyle McCord did not bring to the table last year for Ohio State.
You're absolutely right about that. For me, I want to see it first. I want to see how this Chip Kelly system marries with the talent they have. But the bigger question I have, even more than quarterback, is offensive line. Like, in order, everything starts in the trenches. You could argue the reason why Ohio State has lost to Michigan 3 years in a row is because they have gotten bullied on the line of scrimmage, specifically on the offensive line. And while they brought in transfers everywhere and brought guys back everywhere, the biggest question still remains on their offensive line. You see reports coming out of training camp. It does not seem like it's gotten that much better. They've gotten beat in the past before. And if you are now going to Eugene and expecting to win a national title this year, I don't think you could be deficient on the offensive line, because if those 5 guys are not blocking, I don't care then who's in the backfield. The holes are not opening. And I don't care how creative Chip Kelly and or Ryan Day can be. If those 5 guys are not getting a push off the line of scrimmage, your offense is dead. And I don't think, at least right now going into the season, I don't think there's been enough improvement in that area specifically for me to feel good about picking Ohio State to win the conference.
But can Oregon transition from a Pac-12, where physicality is not the name of the game, to the Big Ten? What's that gap in physicality between an Oregon team last year? Now, instead of facing teams like Arizona, Arizona State, some of those Pac-12 teams, you are going to face a physical Big Ten week in and week out. And yeah, Oregon was right there, maybe 1 or 2 plays away in their losses to Washington last season. But still, Michigan, with their physicality, ultimately slowed down a high-octane Washington team in the national championship. Ohio State certainly was not at the level that you would expect an Ohio State team to be along the offensive front last year. But is it Ohio State, Michigan, Penn State, Iowa? Because of that physicality, how do those Pac-12 teams, specifically Oregon, because it is well known and probably not a bad assumption to make that they're the class of those 4 new teams joining the Big Ten, how do they stack up against those Big Ten powers?
in college football, right? You say like a team takes on the identity of their head coach because really the head coach is the one constant. You have players coming in and out. I would argue, like, I think Dan Lanning, his style is based on physicality. Like, he does bring a lot of the tenets that the Georgia Bulldogs have. He brings that out west to Eugene, whereas, like, you watch Oregon, and yeah, like, you could, they have an explosive offense, and there are definitely monikers around explosive offense that, you could also use synonyms like soft in the past. But I don't, like, for how prolific Oregon's offense is, I think their main tenet as a team is physicality. And I think they take that from their head coach, where Dan Lanning wants them to play fast, physical, smart. Like, I do think in this modern era of college football, where you can't just be finesse, you can't just, for the most part, be power. You have to be a combination of both. Like, if you look at the landscape right now of college football, I would say Georgia, Oregon, Ohio State's trying to be. We'll see if the offensive line can hold up. I think that's what their identity is trying to gear towards. Like, those are the teams I would say right now are perfectly built to win in this current era of college football. I think Oregon, for me, like, the questions I have about Oregon, physicality and how they'll hold up, to me is not a question.
My question, as I said when I rambled to start, the question about Oregon is that their 4 best players, right? And CBS released its top 100 players. Oregon's 4 best in that top 100 are all transfers new to the program this season. So I think it's naive to think, and maybe in today's day and age of college football with the portal, you just should assume that they can acclimate. I don't know if it's changed, and maybe it's a false assumption to make, but you don't just replace Troy Franklin with Evan Stewart, who really underachieved at Texas A&M. Dylan Gabriel, yeah, it seems like a natural fit. And I guess you can ask the same question about some of Ohio State, but they have so many freshmen coming in, so many returnees. I think Ohio State's a more known commodity. And then you go further down the list, should we be considering Penn State? Ohio State has to go to Oregon and Penn State. They don't have the favorable schedule. Oregon doesn't have to play Penn State this year. Penn State has a favorable schedule, as probably a favorable schedule as you could possibly ask for in the Big Ten. Still challenging. Don't play Iowa. Do have to go on the road to USC and Wisconsin. Who are the dark horses in the league? I think there's so many layers to it. On paper, Ohio State's probably the most talented team, 1A, 1B with Oregon. But when you start to look at newcomers, portal, schedule, Oregon playing a Big Ten schedule for the first time, there's a lot that goes into just saying, it's August 22nd, who's the best team in the Big Ten? Who's going to be there? Who's going to be left standing when you get to mid-January at the end of the season?
I'm glad you mentioned the word dark horse, because as you dive more into this ESPN article, there are at least current right now projections for the 12-team college football playoff. They have Oregon as a 6th seed, hosting the 3rd Big Ten team in the playoff, number 11 Penn State. So they have 3 Big Ten teams making the playoff. And then just like bracketology, right? What do? They have the first 4 out. First 4 out are all SEC teams: LSU, Missouri, Tennessee, Oklahoma. Then they have the next 4 out. Top of that next 4 out, or basically the 5th team out of the college football playoff, at least right now projection-wise, are the Michigan Wolverines. I want to ask you this one, Tripp, here. I feel like the 3 Big Ten teams in no order, Oregon, Ohio State, and Penn State, most people would agree those should be the 3 Big Ten teams to make the college football playoff. If we do have a 4th Big Ten team make it, would you say Michigan is the conference's best chance to be that 4th team?
I think it's Iowa. They don't face Michigan. They don't face Penn State. They don't face Oregon. And they don't face USC. New offensive coordinator, Tim Lester. Obviously, the news came out earlier today. Kirk Ferentz suspended for the first game of the season because of their recruitment of Cade McNamara, a 7-year veteran at quarterback for the Hawkeyes. But they're going to play good defense. And I think they are superior enough in terms of their defense. And if they can get just a little more offensive production, when you look at their schedule, I keep coming back to that, but when you look at an 18-team league now, where you're going to have different teams facing each other every year, the schedule really it's probably not going to dictate who's going to win or lose the conference. I still think the best 2 teams are going to emerge at the end, but it could really dictate 3, 4, 5. Who is that team that is the quote-unquote dark horse to get into the college football playoff. And that's the assumption. I think for Penn State, you can circle the Ohio State game and ask, okay, is this the year they can finally break through against Ohio State? They don't play Michigan this year, but can they break through against Ohio State? The result of that game shouldn't dictate whether Penn State makes or does not make the college football playoff. That game dictates whether Penn State will be playing for a Big Ten championship or not. The games that will determine if Penn State makes the playoff are at West Virginia, a team that probably should be ranked to start the year and wasn't. A team that really is improved on the defensive side with their portal pickups. Garrett Green's a tremendous quarterback, very dangerous with his legs, and it seems like he's improved a lot as a passer. Penn State going on the road to Camp Randall, that's a tough game, and going on the road to USC. Those 3 road games that Penn State is going to be favored in, barring injury, those are the games that probably will determine whether or not they make the playoff. So I think it's easy when you think about a 4-team playoff, you circle what's the biggest game of the year, right? Ohio State, Michigan. It doesn't matter if Ohio State or Michigan win that game. Sure, it certainly helps. But in the past, that was a pseudo play-in game for the college football playoff. Now, your one signature game isn't necessarily the most important game on your schedule. It's those fringe games where you're a borderline favorite or avoiding the big upset. That now becomes the most important path and viable path to making a 12-team college football playoff.
Iowa's interesting because you're right. You look at their schedule. They play Iowa State week 2 at home, it's good that it's at home. Mm-hmm. A lot of people are high on Iowa State, but that's a game that Iowa should win. Outside of that game, the only other game, they'll be favored in every game besides one, at Ohio State on October 5th. Everything else you look at, Wisconsin, Nebraska comes to town. You're at UCLA. Washington comes to town. We should probably be looking at 11-1 Iowa team that, like you said, maybe without a marquee win, but they'll be favored in 11 out of 12 games.
I think they'll be favored, but to assume Iowa, I think when you stack up, and I'm just going to use, and again, this is not going to be a Penn State homer podcast, but they're a great example because of where they fit in this picture, right? They're one of those few teams, Penn State, Notre Dame, maybe like a Texas, Oklahoma. Those are teams that probably benefit, Florida State, that benefit the most from the expansion of the college football playoff. Mm-hmm. So we're familiar with it, Big Ten podcast. Penn State as an example here. Penn State, when you stack them up head-to-head against Rutgers, Maryland, even in Iowa, based on pure talent, you do expect them to win the game. Iowa, I think, is good, but I think they're more susceptible than a Penn State to a loss or two where they're not favored because they just don't have the plethora of 4, 5-star players, especially at the skill positions, that can overcome a day where maybe you have your B game or your C game against an inferior opponent. So I think saying, Iowa 11-1 is far-fetched. Now, I think Iowa 8-1 is reasonable. And then what happens in those other games on their schedule is going to determine, do they get over the hump? Does a 10-2 Iowa without a signature win make a playoff? Or is it an SEC team? Or is it someone else in the Big Ten? I think that's where you start to delineate, and it will be interesting when the selection committee makes these picks. That's where I see Iowa this year, an 8 to potentially 10 win team. And if they get to 10 wins, do they have enough to qualify?
That's the one downside with them in their schedule is if you don't beat Ohio State, there's not really a chance of a marquee win. I think the committee does value who you beat, and that's going to be a tough argument there for the Hawkeyes, even if we're talking about 10 or 11 wins for them this season. To answer the question I asked first, and then I want to make one other point here. Uh-huh. Michigan, I would say, is not the best team in terms of the Big Ten's chances of getting a 4th team. I just think they lost too much. Look at what they lost this year. They have just 28% of their offensive production returning. They lost 11 players last year that were either All-Americans or All Big Ten. Head coach, coordinators, quarterback, running back, top receiver, all 5 offensive linemen. I know Sharon Moore is there, so there's supposed to be continuity. when you just look at the mass exodus of Michigan's team this year, I just think they lost too much to expect them to be 10-2 and right back in the picture, especially when Texas comes to town in week 2. Very difficult game. You're on the road at Ohio State. You play Oregon. They come to you, but still, it's a very tough game. Like, they are playing 3 of the preseason top 4 teams in the country in their schedule, and that's not including losable games like USC. Like, I just think right now, if you look at Michigan, they are the reigning national champs. So I think that's part of the reason why they are lumped into this conversation. I want to hear your thoughts quickly here first, but I have a team that you did not mention, like the Iowa pick, outside the box as well. That could be a dark horse here to make an unexpected run if the Big Ten wants to get a surprise 4th team in. What are your thoughts on Michigan here?
Man, first on Michigan, I think what's fascinating is they took on the personality, and part of it was rallying behind him. They took on such the personality of Jim Harbaugh. And the assumption that Sharon Moore's been there and they're going to continue with that same chip on their shoulder, that same tenacity, that same identity, I think that's a bold assumption to make for Michigan. I think they're talented. They've recruited great players. I think their defense is going to be good. I think the style of play on offense can overcome some shortcomings. Donovan Edwards is a great back. But to assume a first-time starter at quarterback is going to have success against that type of schedule, it's a bold one. We probably have undervalued Michigan. I know they won the national championship, but the last 3 years prior, they're really good. It's a great program. But I agree with you, at least on paper, it seems like they will be more outside looking in at the end of the year. And if they aren't, then that's really a testament to what the coaching staff has been able to do to get them to turn the page from national champions to where they are this year, even with all that outside noise that's still going on around the program.
I would like to live up to my nickname here of Hot Take Hickey. I would like to throw the first hot take by you here and get your thoughts again. You are the voice of reason. I'll be, I guess, the village idiot here throwing out crazy thoughts.
Can I take a guess?
Sure.
You're going to say Rutgers.
You know, I like Rutgers this year. I do. It is not Rutgers. Similar color scheme. Nebraska.
Wisconsin? Nebraska.
Nebraska. They named Dylan Raiola on Wednesday.
A lot of faith.
Their starting quarterback. He is, what would you say? Look, on paper, he is the best quarterback to get, to play the position for Nebraska since who? At least throw the football. Eric Crouch?
I mean, Taylor Martinez, they had some really good years with Taylor Martinez.
He was a runner, though. Not taking anything away, but if you terms of just passer, Nebraska has had athletic quarterbacks, Adrian Martinez, but in terms of just a pocket thrower, which I still think.
Did I say Taylor? It's games. Adrian, right? What Martinez? There's so many Martinez.
No, you're you're right. He was 2013, 2012.
Yeah.
Yeah, he was incredible.
The end of the Bo Pelini era.
Yes.
Yeah.
Now, they've had athletic quarterbacks, but in terms of throwers of the football, Raiola at least checks a lot of boxes. You look at, I do think Matt Rule's emphasis on turnovers, we were minus 17 last year, and a lot of that because of the quarterback, I think, even though it's a freshman quarterback, I think should be cleaned up. So I don't think you can expect to be losing the turnover battle almost 2 a game.
That's putting a lot of faith in a freshman quarterback.
Okay. All right, so let me 2 other things quickly here then. They were 1-5 in close games last year. I would argue better quarterback play in those close games can help win a game or 2. And their schedule is favorable. They should, again, freshman, I will put a lot of faith in Dylan Raiola here. Look at their schedule: UTEP, Colorado, Northern Iowa, Illinois, at Purdue, Rutgers, at Indiana. I will say 7-0. Maybe a more sane man will say 6-1. Either way, very favorable start before you go on the road at Ohio State. I won't get too crazy here. They finished their last 4 games. UCLA at home, at USC, Wisconsin at home, at Iowa. To your point, Lisa, before, when you look at marquee games, right, in terms of games that will determine who's in the college football playoff and who's not, that Iowa game, that Black Friday, could be, for both teams, a potential play-in game. Are you buying optimism here with Nebraska? Are you buying into a big jolt with Dylan Raiola here? What are your expectations for Nebraska as they finally named their phenom quarterback QB1?
I think a reasonable expectation for Nebraska is a winning season. They've had 7 consecutive losing seasons. Their 5 wins last year, tied for their most wins since 2016. I know it's bold. I know it's a hot take. I know it's a popular pick because Matt Rule has been incredibly successful everywhere he's coached college football. I think Nebraska could be a 7, 8, 9 win team. They are not, with a freshman quarterback, my opinion, a true college football playoff dark horse contender, even with the expanded playoff in the schedule you detailed. Mike Riley went 9-4 in 2016. That is their last winning season. To say all of a sudden Nebraska's back this year is unfathomable to me. And I think fans right now, this is where you want a Bo Pelini. 9-10 wins, guaranteed every season. Won the Big Ten. Remember it was Leaders and Legends? They won the Legends division in 2012. Right. But to be back at that in 2 years of Matt Rule, with how competitive the conference is, with no divisions, this is a year. Could you imagine if you still had, let's take USC, Oregon, Washington, UCLA out of the picture? Who would you pick to come out of? This is a year where Nebraska, if they had East and West, they're one year too late. Because, sure, I would think Nebraska and Iowa are duking it out for the Big Ten West. But now, no shot.
All right, so there's the call. I tried, Cornhuskers fans. I tried to get the voice of reason on our side for this one. Not believing it. But you know what? Look, we'll circle back to that opinion here a month from now, 2 months from now. We'll see how Dylan Raiola does play early on and see if that inspires any more confidence in the Tripper over here.
Well, I mean, I know they're hoping that he does more than look like Mahomes. They want him to play like Mahomes.
You have a problem with that?
No, not at all. Not at all.
It's a good guy to model stuff after. That is for sure. Yeah, the resemblance is honestly scary. I'm sure if he was like in a Kansas City airport, I bet you there'd be at least like 5 people confused.
Yeah, I'd probably say more than 5. There are some people of this podcast that would probably rather be Travis Kelce than Patrick Mahomes, though.
It's as a Swiftie, yourself. I'm sure. Yeah, are you a big? You approve of Travis?
You went there on the first episode.
Of course, we got it. I mean, I think this is really why people tune in. You are a diehard Swiftie. You went international. Hold on. You can't say you're not you went to London to watch her. How many concerts have you been to on the Eras tour? How many concerts have you been to? 2, including an international trip. You are a diehard. Whether you want to admit it or not, you are a diehard Swiftie. And as a diehard Swiftie, I think you are qualified more than most to answer, do you approve of Taylor's boyfriend?
I've rehashed this topic so many times. I know it all too well. Let's just shake it off and go on to the next thing.
Oh, my goodness. Travis Kelce does not get the seal of approval from Brian Tripp. How about that? Well, let me ask you this then.
I approve.
Seal of approval.
I approve.
Well, that does not sound very convincing. Let me tell you, if I was,
I can tell you're
Travis
not a
and you were
Swiftie
Taylor's
because
dad,
what I just said went right over your head. You're definitely not a Swiftie. What I just said went right over.
Shake it off. Look, maybe it's because I've known you too long here. I heard the reference and I said, let's just keep it moving. Let's just move on here.
Yeah, it's time to move on.
Speaking of approval, we do have 4 new teams. Shockingly, I know, entering the Big Ten this year: Oregon, Washington, UCLA, USC. We had a discussion off air that I thought was very interesting because I have not heard really anyone else talk about it. When you hear conversations about how, these 4 teams coming to the Big Ten, the conversation is always what? How are these 4 teams going to adjust to the Big Ten style of football? And you asked a question, Tripp, that I want to tee up for here. And that is, are we sure we should be asking that question of who is the worst adjusted, if you will, to the Big Ten? Do you think it's actually not those 4 teams and somebody else?
Yeah, I think it's a great discussion point. We talked about Oregon and their physicality and the physicality of the Pac-12. That is undoubtedly a question coming into the Big Ten. But in modern college football, they at least have offenses and some defense. Yeah, it's not going to completely Oregon has a great defense. Washington was a great all-around team last year. They just lost half of their team, 50% of their team, new coach, all that. But I think those programs at least resemble modern college football a little bit more. If I'm a Big Ten fan, how does a West team, Iowa, Minnesota, Northwestern, Illinois, Brett Bielema, and lining up, and Michigan just won a national championship, I know, but way more talent. Lining up 9 offensive linemen. How did those teams fit in the Big Ten? That instead, not the 4 teams coming in, it's those old school, we're going to rely on winning the Big Ten West, and we know we can play ground and pound football, not turn it over, play some defense, and hope to be standing at the end of the year. But any of the Big Ten West teams, the previous Big Ten West, and you can include Nebraska in it, you can include Purdue in it, you can include Wisconsin, although Luke Fickell has modernized their approach. Do any of those teams, do they ever have really, in the last 6 years, right, dating back to probably 2016, Wisconsin was pretty talented. Did any of those teams really have a chance to stack up with the talents and the skill and the overall depth? Depth is the most important thing in college football. It's depth. What separates the great teams from the really good teams? Like Maryland's starting 11 on offense and defense were pretty good last year. On
right.
paper, pretty good. But everyone, they're going to Ohio State. Yeah, they were in that game for a long time. Talia Tagovailoa turned the ball over. But why over 4 quarters can't Maryland beat Penn State? Why can't they beat Ohio State? Why can't they beat Michigan? Depth. You need depth in college football. And I think it's more difficult for those Big Ten West teams to adapt to the new Big Ten. Now that you include USC, Oregon, Washington, and UCLA, I think it's worse for them than the 4 teams coming in. So the question should be, how does Illinois fit? What's the future of Illinois football? What's the future of Northwestern football? What's the future of Wisconsin and Purdue and Iowa, Nebraska? What's the future of Indiana? Your traditional Midwest football teams? How do they fit? I think it's more of a East Coast, Ohio State, Michigan, Penn State, and the West Coast. That's the Big Ten. How do these other teams morph into what these programs have identified as scheme, culture, and how they fit the modern college football?
I couldn't agree more. Like, even I would lump Rutgers in that conversation as well. Like, just teams that are just like, whether it's style, whether it's talent, like I'm with you 1,000,000%. I think the 4 teams coming in are much better equipped right now, either to hit the ground running in the case of Oregon, or build to it in the cases of, I would say, Washington, USC, and especially UCLA. I think they are, whether it's resources, whether it's kind of scheme fit, where they're located, in Southern California, all that talent right there in their backyard for UCLA and USC. Like, I think they have a much easier time of adjusting right now to this conference. And I think it's going to be harder, like you said, for a lot of those teams kind of battling in the Big Ten West, kind of sitting right there around 500. But anytime they played, a top talent in Ohio State or Michigan, or some years Michigan State, they just get their doors blown off because they don't have the depth, they don't have the talent, they don't have the offensive scheme that you can run and have success with in 2024. All those teams, I think, are at a bigger disadvantage now. And even though you've been in the conference and you're used to playing Ohio State, doesn't mean you could beat them or you're closer to it. I'm with you. Like, it's a conversation that I haven't heard many people bring up, but I think it's an important one because, I think those 4 teams coming in are much better equipped at having either immediate or future success in this conference versus teams that have been here for years and decades.
And maybe standards and expectations are different, right? If you're Northwestern, maybe you're happy to make it to a bowl game. If you're Nebraska, maybe you're happy to be a fringe playoff team. If you're Iowa, you want to be a fringe playoff team. Like USC, there's no question. Like, let's go through a couple of things here. Most pressure of any head coach in the Big Ten this year is probably Lincoln Riley, right? At USC. That's what I would think, right?
Ooh, you would not say Ryan Day? I would say, honestly, above Lincoln Riley, I would put Ryan Day and James Franklin for different reasons and different expectations. Like, I guess part of it is like, what are you expecting from USC, and what's the blowback if they don't like if they go 8-4 this year, let's say in the Big Ten with Miller Moss at quarterback? What's the blowback?
I think it puts him in an extremely precarious position for 2025. That's what I think. I think he's under the most pressure. I do, because they started last year preseason Pac-12 favorites. Caleb Williams, unbelievable talent, and it seems like that talent's going to translate to the NFL with what he's done so far in Chicago training camp and preseason. I know it's far from it, but they finished 7-5, won 6 straight games to start the year, lost 5 of their last 6. They lost at home to UCLA. That can't happen. A quarterback whisperer going into his 3rd season. I think Lincoln Riley, the bar is so high there, and they're going to want to be successful immediately in the Big Ten. I don't disagree with you. James Franklin, the expectations, Penn State has to be in the playoff, if not just in the playoff, win a playoff game. Ryan Day, you have to beat Michigan. but like,
I love the pause.
But as I'm about, well, the pause is, okay, what happens if Michigan's your only loss and you win the national championship? Like, I think Ryan Day gets a pass for that.
He better get a pass.
I would hope. But they've been there. James Franklin has won 10+ games 5 times and has been to 5 New Year's 6 bowl games since 2016. I think, yeah, the fan bases of Ohio State and Penn State want to win more. But is there really you're not going to, who are you going to replace them with? Lincoln Riley, if they have another 7-win season, another 8-win season, and then the following year have another 7-win season, he's gone. That's not the case right now for Ryan Day and James Franklin. Absolutely. And if those schools were to consider doing that because of a 10-win season, 11-win season, those schools are crazy. Look at Nebraska. Do you want to be Nebraska? Do you want to be Nebraska and be searching for a coach time and time again? And there's other examples, but in the Big Ten.
I guess I just look at in terms of like actual chance of fireability if things go wrong. It may sound stupid, but if Ryan Day loses to Michigan for a 4th straight year with all the talent, all the hype, and they win 1 playoff game and get bounced in, I mean, can we steal basketball? By the way, really fast, can we steal basketball terms like Elite 8? Are we allowed to say that? Final
Sure.
4?
Yeah.
Okay. If they lose in the Elite 8, let's say Ohio State, I think there is a chance he is fired. No. If Penn State misses the college football playoff, I think there is a chance James Franklin is fired. If Lincoln Riley and USC go 8-4, I think there's no chance he's fired.
I do.
Okay. So you would say, in terms of like fireability meter, you have Lincoln Riley at number, like not in the conference, but just in terms of going below expectations. Of those 3 guys, you would say Lincoln Riley is like number 1 in terms of like the hottest seed out of those 3?
He probably is the hottest seat in the conference.
Interesting. Very fascinating. Okay, that brings me then. Let's finish the show here with a few rapid questions. That brings me, let's stick on with the USC topic. Their defense in past years stunk, right? It's part of the reason why they missed out on the college football playoff and winning a Pac-12 title 2 years ago, and everything was a disaster last year.
They gave up 49 points to Cal last year. Like, that's all you have to say. They gave up 49 points to Cal last year.
Period. Stop. It was rough. Equally rough is Iowa's offense. I mean, historically bad, we know. They have a new OC in Tim Lester. USC is a new DC now in Danton Lynn. Which unit do you expect to take a bigger jump here in 2024? USC's defense, Iowa's offense?
I love Danton Lynn.
Great hire.
Great hire. Iowa's offense. Because,
wow.
Well, I think the coordinator change, the schedule, I think it's easier for them to make the jump. USC can have a lot of talent, but I think Iowa, and a marginal gain for Iowa's offense puts them in position to win 10 to 11 games that we were talking about at the beginning of the pod. Iowa's offense, if they're average, makes them pretty bona fide threat to win 10 games this year. USC's defense probably has to be, you won't notice the strides made on USC's defense as much because their offense is probably going to be good, but not dynamic enough to keep the defense out of being in precarious positions. So I think, while I think both units may grow an equal amount, you're going to notice Iowa's offense more. So I'm going to say Iowa's offense.
It's definitely easier to notice offense. I will say USC's defense, though, because you look at Dan Lynn specifically, you look at what he did. Like, this is a guy that came to UCLA last year. In 1 year, he took UCLA's defense, that was 87th in total defense in 2022, turned them into 11th last year. They're the number one rushing defense in the country. So this is a guy that is able to at least come in with not a lot of talent and get the best out of them. And so, well, I think it's definitely harder to look at and maybe notice with a naked eye. I do think USC's defense will be better. I just think the coaching, for me, it's going to come down to coaching. I would say talent for USC's defense and Iowa's offense, I would say is about equal. I don't think one is more lopsided than the other. And so I'll just take it down strictly to coaching. And I think Danton Lynn is he's better what he does defensively than Tim Lester, what he does offensively. I'll take USC's defense.
Man, he's got the chops with his dad as the coach. He's been in the NFL with the Bills, the Chargers, Texans, Ravens safeties coach, DC. It's a quick ascension. Danton Lynn is 34 years old. He's younger than me.
That's insane.
He is one of the rising stars in the coaching industry, particularly in college football, but I think additionally the NFL.
And with USC right being in the spotlight this year, if it's a better than expected season, 9-3, 10-2, his name is going to be out there for head coaching abilities or openings very quickly. I'm with you. He's a coach on the rise for sure. Speaking of jumps, Tripp, general here, win total, how you feel about him. What team in the Big Ten do you think will take the biggest jump from last year to this year?
Rutgers. I think they got a favorable schedule. I like what Greg Schiano's done there. I think they're going to have better quarterback. If they can just get decent quarterback play. What they did, they were tough. Their defense was tough last year. I think if they can have a little bit more on offense, I think Rutgers is in position to make the biggest jump.
I would say, they have the most underrated running back with Kyle Monunga. Like we talk about the duo at Ohio State, the duo at Penn State. This is a guy that just churns out yards, and he's tremendous as well. One of the most underrated RBs. I'll go Indiana. There's a lot of change there in Bloomington, but I love the Kirk Cignetti hire, and this is a guy that has won a ton of games. If you want to forget like FCS and everything, just look at his FBS record 2 years at JMU, 19-4. This guy, I would say, similar path to Kalen DeBoer, where the guy just wins everywhere he goes. You bring in Curtis Rourke from the MAC conference, second team MAC player last year. Like, this is a quarterback that at least is competent. And you look at least some of the talent they brought in, Elijah Surratt, receiver at JMU last year. Like, this could be maybe their most explosive offense they've had since 2020 with Michael Penix Jr. and Kalen DeBoer. They won 3 games last year. Their Vegas over-under is 5.5, so already at least they're kind of giving them 2 wins. You look at the schedule, it could get to 7 wins. Maybe a little bit optimistic here in the preseason, but you talk about a 4-win jump from 3 to 7. I think Indiana could be that team that takes the biggest jump this year.
I just don't think they have enough talent yet, and I like what he's done in not only bringing players but staff members from JMU with him to Indiana and Bloomington as well. But I think they could be a 4 or 5. I think a 5-win season for Indiana this year is the first year for Kurt Cignetti is a good year. And I agree. I think he was a great hire there, and I look forward to seeing what he can do.
Bringing the energy, too. That's for sure. It should be a good time there in Bloomington.
They need an identity. Like, Indiana's always just been Indiana football. It's a basketball school. It's always going to be a basketball school. It's a tough place to recruit because you're never going to get the best kids in the area. How do you go outside of the area and bring talent in? But a school like that, you need an identity, a personality, something. And I think that's what he's started to do. And he's been bold. He's been bold about what they want to achieve and not shying away from being a modern college football program. That's the biggest thing. Yeah. How do you differentiate yourself when Notre Dame, Ohio State, Michigan, and basketball and the Indianapolis Colts, you're always playing third, fourth fiddle to those teams in recruiting, in interest, in media coverage, Kentucky, Louisville, not far away. Like what is Indiana's niche there? And how can it's not how do you take kids that are going to go to Ohio State? How do you get kids that would rather go to Kentucky and Purdue and Louisville and maybe steal a kid from Notre Dame and to be the best in your area, Purdue, Northwestern, Illinois? How do you get them to come to you? And I think you need some sort of personality and brand for it. And I think that's what he started to do there, at least.
They could be and really should be the Kentucky of the Big Ten in terms of football wise. Where like Mark Stoops has an identity. He's been quiet, but now he's getting bolder. He did make that proclamation about Kentucky not just being a basketball school. Cignetti's definitely more outspoken without a doubt than Mark Stoops. But you know what you're expecting with Kentucky football most years. They win some big games. They win anywhere from 8 to 10 games a year. Like they are pretty consistent. That, in a few years, at least should be where Indiana is. And then, like you said, maybe those few recruiting battles, those few transfer portal additions could be the difference between being Kentucky and then all of a sudden 1 year or 2 years propelling yourself into a conversation about making the Big Ten championship. Like it's definitely, I said in the conversation. I mean, you mentioned the start of the show, Iowa in the conversation for the Big Ten title game. And by the way, I don't think you're crazy. Like you get a schedule break, you get things go your way. Some years, 10-2, and maybe in the conference, 8-1
playoff. I said maybe a backdoor into the playoff. Okay. At no point in the next 5 to 10 years do I see anyone besides Ohio State, Michigan, Penn State, USC, or Oregon, maybe Washington. I don't see anyone dethroning those teams with NIL, modern college football, the coaches in place, the resources. If you're a middle tier Big Ten team, your best bet is try to make the top 12. I don't know who or how in today's day and age of college football with NIL, money, resources, anyone can jump from tier 2, tier 3 to the tier 1, which is Ohio State, Michigan, Penn State, Oregon, USC, maybe UCLA, Washington, Michigan State. Like they might be dormant right now, and Washington was in the national championship game last year, so they're a little bit of an anomaly. UCLA and Michigan State have better potential to be the ones that in 3 to 4 to 5 years you recognize than some of these other schools, just because the resources eventually will be there. And Chip Kelly did a great job at UCLA, but they've kind of been not what you would think. Like, to me, it's those schools, maybe Nebraska, but it's not the Indianas and Purdue's. They're going to be the Indianas and Purdue's of the new Big Ten.
I agree, but I do think what I'll say, the one thing that helps them here in the expanded Big Ten and the expanded college football playoff is like if the schedule breaks your way, again, this is we're talking about 1 in 5 years, maybe 1 in 7 years. Like you do get those breaks where the schedule works in your favor. Maybe it's either a home balance, skewed home, or you miss most of the big dogs.
Yep.
You have, a veteran quarterback and a good system. Like we've seen, again, Indiana, COVID year 2020. But Michael Penix Jr. in that offense, they were a top 10 team until kind of the bottom fell out and he got hurt. Like, I think it's easier now to kind of drum up a perfect storm, if you will, 1 year out of 7, let's say, to kind of shoot up the rankings, just be a surprise team versus when there was 4 teams in the Big Ten, East and West, and Indiana was just cut off now by Ohio State. Like, I'm not saying it's going to happen, but I think once every 5 to 7 years, you could have a
look at Mel Tucker
at
Michigan State a couple of years ago. Mel Tucker at Michigan State, all the portal guys come in, and the program is a mess after it, but they got there because of the portal.
Right.
So
and they parlayed that into
I guess
I'm not sitting here they're going to be consistent and they're going to even be on the level, but like we could agree. I think sometimes a 10-2 record is not as good as it seems on the surface. You get plenty of benefits and breaks that go your way to help boost that win total, be better than the talent on your roster says. And if you get that, good schedule break, maybe a tough roundabout conference schedule up top for the big dogs. I'm just saying you could find yourself in the conversation, not even in there. Speaking of conversation, speaking of college football playoff, let's end the debut pod here of Still Enrolled, a Big Ten football podcast.
There's no way anyone is still listening.
Fair. So we're talking to ourselves here. But this counts. This is on the record. We are holding you to this prediction. when it's all said and done, dust settles, December rolls around. You don't have to name the teams if you want to, extra points. How many, though, Big Ten teams will be in the college football playoff when it's all said and done?
3.
Should we say them together in no order?
It's Ohio State, Oregon, and Penn State.
I
think there's a lot of teams that are going to be close, but in the end, those 3.
I would agree. I think 3 Big Ten teams is all we'll get. I don't think Michigan has enough. We've talked about Iowa, Nebraska, some of the teams I think could be fringe, kind of nipping at the heels, if you will, or maybe just better than we expect in general. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I think it's all said and done. 3 Big Ten teams: Ohio State, Oregon, Penn State. No order there. Will be the 3 Big Ten teams in the inaugural 12-team college football playoff. So that'll do. Congratulations, you made it. This has been the first episode of Still Enrolled, a Big Ten football podcast. A few
this
quick
is like making it through.
Notes.
You know, Ryan, this is like making it through the first class and sitting there and suffering through the syllabus.
I don't know, suffering. Jeez, I don't think it was bad. I don't think it was that bad. My God. I'm not getting a root canal here. We're talking Big Ten football.
This is going to be fun. This is going to be really fun.
I see you love working with me already. Man. What's next? You're going to compare the next show to like taking the SAT? Oh, thank God I'm out of there. That felt like 5 hours.
The ACT was harder than the SAT.
I would agree with that. Way different brain function. You're right about that.
Can we start the next show by rattling off our scores from those tests?
I would rather not, because I'm afraid Penn State would retroactively take my degree away and say, why do we let this kid in here? We made a big mistake. Let's write it right now.
We're comm majors.
That's right. We're not here for the brains, that is for sure. If you're watching the pod, you obviously know where to find us. Still Enrolled, a Big Ten football podcast on YouTube. Now, we have a podcast stream coming for those who prefer audio. I don't want to announce where it'll be yet. We're still we're on the 5-yard line here of getting that nailed down. Hopefully by next week, the start, by the way, of the first week of the college football season, we should have the podcast feed ready to go here. So we'll tell you where you can find that. Should be wherever you do get your pods, but once that's official, we'll let you know hopefully by Monday. Speaking of Monday, the pod schedule will be every Monday, every Thursday, moving forward throughout the season on YouTube and wherever you do get your podcasts is where you can find us. And lastly here, what I want to say, we want to hear you as well. This is a fun pod that Brian and I talk a lot to each other. We want to hear your thoughts, whether it's what you like, what you dislike, whether if you agree, disagree, if you think we screwed up a point or missed out on this. Easiest way to get your voice heard on the show, email us, stillenrolledpodcast@gmail.com. That is our email we'll be checking frequently. So if you want to leave us a note, good or bad, drop it there, stillenrolledpodcast@gmail.com. Guess all we have to say is have a great weekend. We'll talk to you Monday right here on the Still Enrolled podcast.